Hi. For those of you that don't know me, I am Mrs. Lorenzini and I teach algebra in the high school. I am going to just give you a little review video for the Pythagorean theorem. Hopefully it helps you out. And then if you have any questions, you can reach out to any of your teachers, okay? Or you can reach out to me. All right. So basically, the Pythagorean theorem is a theorem that states if you have a right triangle, then the square of the leg plus the square of the leg is going to equal the square of the hypotenuse. Okay, so there's basically two things that they ask with this. They either ask you to show or prove that a triangle is a right triangle. That's the type of questions I'm going to do first. Or they ask you to find a missing side of a right triangle. And that's the kind of questions I'll do second. Okay, so first type of question. This is called using the converse. So the converse basically switches that Pythagorean theorem statement. So we're saying if the square of the sum of the legs is equal to the square of the hypotenuse, then yes, this is a right triangle. Okay, so by definition, the hypotenuse has to be the longest side. So we're going to take the 9 as the hypotenuse because 6 and 8 are both smaller than 9. So now I'm testing to see if this is true. Is 6 squared plus 8 squared equal to 9 squared? And this is really a question mark at this point because that's what I'm trying to prove. Okay, now squaring, you did this in your last unit. 6 squared, that means 6 times 6. 8 squared, that means 8 times 8. 9 squared, that means 9 times 9. Okay, so now if I add 36 and 64, I get 100. 100 does not equal 81, so we would say no. If that had been a true statement, then we would have said yes. Okay, so now for number 2, again, the hypotenuse is always the longest side, so the 13 is the hypotenuse. Okay, the hypotenuse is the longest side because it's opposite the largest angle. The largest angle has to be the right angle because every triangle only has 180 degrees altogether. So if you take the 180 degrees and you subtract that 90, there's only 90 left for the other two to share. Okay, so leg squared plus leg squared equals hypotenuse squared. And again, this is a question. Okay, so that gives me 25 plus 144 equals 169. 25 plus 144 is 169. So this is true. So we say yes. So that is a right triangle. Yay! All right, so I'll show you another one. Okay, again, identify the hypotenuse. It's always the largest. So the hypotenuse stays alone. 6 squared plus 8 squared equals 10 squared. And again, this is the question. So we have 36 plus 64 equals 100. 36 plus 64 is 100. So yes, this is a right triangle. Yes, it is. Okay. I hope this helps you. This is called the converse of the Pythagorean theorem. So you're basically proving whether or not something is a right triangle by plugging in the two legs. And it doesn't matter the order. So if you put the 6 first or the 8 first, that wouldn't matter. But the hypotenuse is very specific. Okay, so now let me show you some where you have to find the missing side. Okay, all right, so find the missing side of each triangle, round to the nearest tenth if necessary. So basically, like if you get a square root that's not a perfect square, you're probably going to need your calculator, and that would involve rounding. Okay, so now in this case, I don't know what the largest side is, so I have to go by the diagram. So the side that's opposite the right angle, that's the hypotenuse. Okay, so the Pythagorean theorem states leg squared plus leg squared equals hypotenuse squared. Leg squared plus leg squared equals hypotenuse squared. Now, they're telling me this is a right angle, so that's true. I'm looking for the missing piece. Okay, so a squared is a leg, which they're representing as x, and you could put a or you could put x, it's fine. Plus 12 squared, that's one of the legs, equals 13 squared. Leg squared plus leg squared equals hypotenuse squared. All right, so I still don't know what a squared is. That's the variable. But I do know what 12 times 12 is. And I do know what 13 times 13 is. It is a good idea to know your perfect squares or keep a list or just, use your calculator. All right, so now if this had been a regular linear equation, you would subtract the 144. And that is the same thing we do with a quadratic equation that has no other variable other than the quadratic. So this cancels and I'm left with a squared equals 25. So now I have to think back to that last unit. What is the opposite of squaring? The opposite of squaring is a square root. So I take the square root of both sides and that gives me a equals 5. Now, we're only going to take the positive square root. That's called the principal square root. So we're saying a equals 5. So does 5 make sense? Well, we could plug the 5 back in and see if it works. But as far as just making sense, it does make sense because it's smaller than the 13. If I had gotten a number that was not smaller than the 13, the hypotenuse, something would have been wrong. Okay. So now in this case, I'm missing the hypotenuse and I have 2 legs. So again, leg squared plus leg squared equals hypotenuse squared. And you can use the c or the x, it's fine either way. Okay, so 3 times 3 is 9. 4 times 4 is 16. 9 plus 16 is 25. Okay, so the opposite of squaring is to find the square root. And again, I got 5, but this time the 5 is a hypotenuse. Now that does make sense because the hypotenuse has to be the largest side. Okay, these are actually both examples of Pythagorean triples. If you know your triples, it does make your life a little bit easier because they do tend to show up quite often. So the first triple was a 5, 12, 13 triple, and the second triple was 3, 4, 5. And 3, 4, 5 is probably one of the most popular ones. All right, so what happens when your answer isn't rational? Because that does happen. Irrational numbers do exist. In this case, most of the time they do ask you to round, and that's what nearest tenth means. It does mean that you're going to round. Okay, so one more time. It's leg squared plus leg squared equals hypotenuse squared. All right, so you have to go by the diagram, and the hypotenuse is missing. That's missing, so I'm going to put an X there. You could put a C, okay? So you have 4 squared plus 8 squared equals x squared. 4 squared means 4 times 4. 8 squared means 8 times 8. Okay, so now we're adding 16 plus 64. That's going to be 80. So now, if you know your perfect squares, 80 is super close to 81, so our answer is going to be really close to 9, okay? So we take the square root of both sides, and we get x is approximately, I'm going to show you on my calculator. My calculator is a little different, Okay, so on mine, my square root is right here above the x squared, which is the same place as on yours, just it looks a little different. Okay, and then I do the square root of 80, and I hit enter. So 8.94, super close. Think of like 9 as being $9, and then somebody said to you, I have $8.94. They're really close. Okay, so they want the nearest tenth, so the 9 looks at the 4, and the 4 says stay. So our answer is going to be 8.9. Now, 8.9 makes sense because it's bigger than 8. The hypotenuse is always the longest side. Okay? All right, so let me just show you one more. All right, so leg squared plus leg squared equals hypotenuse squared. 3 times 3 is 9, 6 times 6 is 36, so c squared equals the sum of those two. 36 plus 9 is 45. And now I have to take the square root of both sides. So the square root is the inverse or opposite of squaring, and that's how you solve equations. You always do the opposite, go backwards, okay? So c is approximately, and I have to do the square root of 45. Now, I don't know the square root of 45. I can think of two numbers it's in between, but I don't know the square root of 45, and that's because it's irrational. Okay, 6.70. So we're going to go with 6.7 because when you round, you always look at the one that comes after. So my answer is going to be 6.7, which again makes sense because the hypotenuse is the longest side. Well, hopefully this helps you, and I hope that you are having a great time, and I hope to see many of you in algebra class. Take care.